Thank you so much, Michael. I also wanted to thank Katie Freeman and Tanaïs and Pitchaya and Souvankam. I'm going to be reading from This Is One Way to Dance, which comes out next week. It's my debut essay collection. And I've written about visibility and invisibility, but I've been thinking mostly about kin these days, and I think a failure of imagination to see each other as kin. Who is our kin? I think that is the fundamental question right now. And just thinking about George Floyd. I'm going to read from an essay called Kinship, Cousins, and Khichdi, which it's an essay in 7 parts, and I'm reading part 5. Brooklyn. The opportunity to move to New York came up unexpectedly, and I jumped at it. I rented a room in a good friend's Park Slope apartment, about 8 blocks it turned out, from one of my second cousins. I had met Sugethu and his wife and sons 4 years ago in Bombay, where they had lived while he worked on a nonfiction book about the city. The Mehtas are not a branch of the family I knew while growing up. My path crossed with Sugethu's parents and sisters only at large family weddings. My closer relatives kept telling me I should meet him, the other creative writer in the family. I was apprehensive and a little shy about meeting a relative by email and showing up at his apartment in Bombay. I did it anyway. Sugethu and his wife graciously hosted me for a couple of days. I still remember meeting them that morning. They had been out when I arrived the night before. Hi, they said. Coffee? It was awkward, all of us in our pajamas with morning hair, but they put me at ease. Sugethu made a spicy corn and mushroom dish for dinner that night. I still remember it, his cooking and chatting with me. He teased me about what a slow eater I am. That's something else my relatives do, tease me. In Brooklyn, I was sitting at Ozzy's, a coffee shop on 5th Avenue, across from my apartment, trying to write, when Sugethu walked by. Having never lived near any one of my extended family, it was the only time I'd ever just run into one of them. Ozzy's, a cafe with lots of tables for writers to park themselves with their laptops and cappuccinos for hours, boasted one unbroken wall of windows adjacent to the sidewalk. We waved at each other and Sugethu came in to chat. Come over for dinner soon, he said. My in-laws arrived this week. Lots of people say, come over, and lots of people don't follow up. We all know how it is. Life gets in the way. But Sugethu did call, and I did walk over for dinner. Delicious, spicy South Indian food that his mother-in-law had cooked. This is how I know we're related. I realize in writing this that kinship for me involves food. One rainy afternoon when I was sick, Sugethu came by with khichdi, a mix of yellow lentils and rice that my mother always made when we weren't feeling well. I had just been heating up some instant tomato soup, another comfort food, when my cousin called. My cough, dramatic, phlegmy, inserted itself like static into our conversation, making it difficult to talk. You sound miserable, he said. Yeah, what can you do, I said. What kind of food would make you feel better? I thought about what my mom would make, food that seems too labor-intensive or thought-intensive when I'm sick. Khichdi or upma, I guess. I'll bring some over later, he said. That's sweet of you to offer, I told him, but you don't have to do that. You can prevail upon your own family, but second cousins are under no obligation to do anything. No problem, he said. I'll just stop by on my way out. I'm meeting friends for dinner. Khichdi delivery, Sugethu said when he buzzed the door later. He presented me with a plastic bag holding a yogurt container filled with khichdi and a small bottle of spicy garlic pickle. Good for the taste, he said, and to chase the cold away. Underscoring family, proximity, a way of expressing care. Another writer friend from India told me he doesn't think the term cousin-sister exists in American English. You are either a cousin or a sister, a cousin or a brother. But in Indian English, including what I grew up speaking, what you say is cousin brother, cousin sister. Sukethu and I are distant enough relatives that our kinship has something to do with choice. We met as adults, share none of the childhood memories I associate with my first cousins. Sukethu cooked up some khichdi that I didn't know how to make and brought it over. That is how, in some specific and fundamental way, I recognize that he's Indian, that I know that he's family. I know he would laugh at this, but it's true. My cousin loves to cook, but someday, if he is not feeling well, I would like to be able to bring over some food. Though he happens to be married to a good cook himself and has a sister of his own, named Sejal, living nearby. That's not just what an Indian girl would do. It's what a cousin friend does, what a cousin sister does. I'm leaving Brooklyn soon to return to the Pioneer Valley, AKA Western Massachusetts. I will remember that khichdi and garlic pickle. Will remember that I want to cook for others, to invite them to my house, to my apartment, to feed them. And isn't that what love is? Feeding and being fed. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Next is we're going to hear from Souvankam Thammavongsa. So there you go. I think you're muted. One sec. See if this does anything.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. I'm going to read from a short story in the story collection called Paris. The sky was black, like the middle of an eye. Red revved the engine, impatient, having to wait for the truck to warm up. She never failed to make her morning shift on time. The truck was an old thing, a thing she had seen on someone's front lawn, a for sale sign taped to the windshield, handwritten in black marker. The make was nothing special. They call it a pickup truck, but she never picked anything up in it, just herself. It might have been the color that drew Red to the truck, and the thought of that big red truck in the parking lot at the plant. It would be the best looking thing there, and it would belong to her. She wanted that. Red worked at the plant like most of the others in town. It was her job to pluck the feathers, make sure the chickens were smooth when they left her. By the time the chickens got to her, they were already dead, their eyes closed tight like they were sleeping. It was almost like what happened in the next room didn't happen at all. Sometimes she could swear she heard the chickens, that sudden desperate flap of wing, as if flight could really take place there. Before Red backed out onto the road, she looked at herself in the rear view mirror. It didn't show her whole face, just the eyes. She lifted herself up from the driver's seat, turned her head to the right, studied the outline of her profile, and tried to imagine her face with a different nose. How maybe if her nose was different, things would be different at the plant too, especially with Tommy. Tommy was her boss, her supervisor, married with 2 young boys. He was nice to her, gave her more shifts than anyone else, and complimented her work. You did good, Red. Keep it up. We've got plans for you. What those plans were, she never knew, just that they had them for her, Sometimes Tommy would buy her a cola from the machine or sit at her table during her lunch breaks. It wasn't how he behaved with the other girls who worked for him. There was no interest in her body. He didn't notice what was there, didn't lean in close or whisper anything. They talked, mostly about his boys and how he was planning a trip to Paris with his wife for Valentine's Day. Tommy's wife, Nicole, had a nose Red wished she could have. It was a thin nose that stuck out from her face and pointed upward. Everyone who worked in the front office had that kind of nose. Nicole always came to the plant's annual Christmas party wearing something fashionable in fabric no one else's clothes were made out of. The material fit tightly around her curves, smoothed out and pressed, not a wrinkle in sight. At these parties, Nicole always stood the whole time in a group with the other wives whose husbands ran or owned the company. This was the one occasion in the year their wives were seen, brought out for show. Sometimes one of them would come over to say hello to a couple of people who worked on the line. They would introduce themselves, shake a few hands, and then go back to stand in a corner with the other wives, as if they'd done some great charity work by breaking away from their huddle. Nicole never came over. Every year at the party, they served fried chicken. It never bothered Red that the pieces she ate could have been from one of those dead chickens that came to her to get plucked. Cut up into pieces like that, there wasn't a face to think of. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. That was great. All right. So next in the order will be Pitchaya. So Pitchaya, feel free to get going.
Hi. I think I'm just going to read from the beginning of my novel, which touches on the idea of arrival and belonging, which I think can connect to ideas of kinship as well. Always she arrives near evening. The last few children in blue and white uniforms have finished their after-school work and are plodding along in small gangs or like her, alone. They don't take notice of her. They have screens in their hands, shoves and teasings to repay, snacks bagged in newsprint to grease up their fingers. In their trail, sparrows tussle over fallen fried crumbs and biscuit sticks trampled to powder by little shoes. A pearl-eyed lottery seller, sensing passers-by from footsteps and the clap of flip-flops, calls out over an open case of closed-pin lottery tickets to whoever craves luck. Her nose picks up the ashen smell always in the air. Somewhere, a garbage heap incinerates underneath a highway overpass. In temples, incense sticks release sweet smoke to the holy and the dead. Flames curl blue in the open-air gas grills of shophouse food stalls. She is a child or a few thousand years old. Would it ever matter? The city will stay this way for her. When she was a uniformed primary schooler herself, walking home along these very streets, she liked to make believe she was a bewildered traveler in a foreign city, drawn forward by alluring strangeness. She couldn't have known then that there would be years ahead when she didn't have to pretend, and years still further ahead when pretending was all she could do. Fresh, fresh, hot, hot, good for kids, delicious for grown-ups. 20 bahts, 20 bahts. She counts on hearing the soy milk lady's sing-songy cry ahead of the others. The thicker the crowd on the sidewalk, the louder the hawkers call out. Stampedes of dusty shoes and shopping bags and stray dogs crisscross near the ground. Canopies of sun-shielding umbrellas and twisty headphone cords drift above. The fruit sellers have laid parrot green pyramids of pomelo on their tables. They holler, "Come, pretty young sister, come sample this." And she tells them, maybe tomorrow, knowing they'll be at the same spot to greet her the next morning as she hurries to catch the 6:45 at the SkyTrain station. Auntie Tofu, Uncle Big Mouth, the egret. She doesn't know their real names, only the monikers her mother mentioned when boasting of discounts negotiated at the produce scale. The vendors picked up half mangosteens to show off the white flesh, balled inside like an unbloomed flower. It's about the time of the year when these particular fruits become plentiful, though that wasn't always the case, especially during the calamitous years. Lifetimes ago, it seems, when orchards drowned and few trucks dared brave watery roads to deliver what little of the crop had been saved. Those days are hardly worth remembering, are they? Everything is now back in its place. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so the last reader before our conversation will be Tanaïs. I believe is reading from their new book, right?
Yes. I'm reading an excerpt from Insensorium, and this essay is called Romantic Scientist. Just before my birth, my father completed his PhD in chemistry, and from then on, we moved wherever his work might take him. Like many scientists, he had a clandestine, wild imagination. He was more of an artist, a sculptor, a student of classical Hindustani and Bengali music, gifted with a sonorous voice that spanned 2 octaves. He loved long drives, of which there would be many, since we lived in a different university town each year of my childhood. And he loved excursions in nature. I was born a day before the anniversary of his mother's death, and as Muslims, we rejected the reincarnation of our ancestors, but he found me, his first daughter, to be the exact replica and likeness of his own mother, who died when he was just a boy of 12. Janani Manuti, he would call me, which translated to, my mother's come back to me again. And I suppose when children are born, their innocence makes us want to give them the earth, a planet free of discord, where bloody assertions of identity don't exist, where they don't know anything about violence. By the time I was 4, I enrolled in kindergarten, the Learning Tree Elementary School in Auburn, Alabama, home of football fanatics and very few Bangladeshis. At 4, I was the youngest girl in my class and soon became the target of a young Persian girl named Faranak, her skin the color of almonds, mine the color of its sheath. She stated the obvious fact: I was dark, I was ugly, and she wanted me to know. You black or you white? The other kids would ask me, and I didn't know what to answer. Some days I was neither black nor white, but I shared the same skin tone as many of the black children. Faranak refused to let me hold her doll that she would bring for show and tell, and I'm uncertain whether or not I started crying or if my teacher, a young white woman we called Miss Michelle, noticed what was happening, because right then and there she stopped our class and had each and every one of us raise our hands. See how we're all different colors? Some of us are white, some of us are black, and some of us are somewhere in between. There's nothing wrong with being in between. Faranak and I, the 2 in-betweens, avoided each other after that. How could she know that as adults, we'd be perceived as the same enemy? My father tried to lift my spirits away from the daily bullying with simple sensory pleasures that the South is rife with. The fragrant notes of that time are embedded in the corners of my mind. We plucked fallen pecans from the trees by the school, roasting them or turning them into sweet pecan pie. I savored my first taste of Southern food, black-eyed peas, fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and gravy. And we celebrated my 5th birthday with a rich chocolate cake that my mom made. I could hardly inhale the scent of Southern flora, abundant with magnolia, longleaf pine, wisteria, and moss. My small lungs were saturated with pollen and wetness, leading to bouts of bronchitis and pneumonia. In the afternoon, sometimes a peacock would appear outside my window, my new friend, and I shared this room with my baby sister. I crumbled a handful of Ritz crackers in my hand and tossed them to the peacock, who fanned open his iridescent teal-eyed feathers as he ate my gifts. A scion is a young shoot or a twig of a plant used for grafting or rooting. A scion is a descendant of a notable family. Today, 33 years later, near our old apartment in Auburn, Alabama, there's a trail of trees in the George Bankston Historic Tree Trail, named after a white research forester and plant physiologist at the University of Auburn. These trees are grafted from scions of heritage trees of the United States, and there are about 40 trees on this trail honoring white people that other white people considered notable, many of them racist and distrustful of the Black and Native people they terrorized and disenfranchised or simply ignored. Some of the trees include George Washington Carver green ash, which is the only scion named for a Black person in the entire grove. Among the trees planted, Lewis and Clark Osage orange, Trail of Tears water oak, General Jackson black walnut, John Hart 11/3/1886, wrongly accused of murder, General Robert E. Lee, sweet gum, Southern bald cypress, Johnny Appleseed apple tree, Mark Twain bur oak, George Hart 11/5/1887, wrongly accused of murder, Lewis and Clark cottonwood, Helen Keller southern magnolia, Charles Humphreys 3/18/1900, wrongly accused of rape, Amelia Earhart sugar maple, Chief Logan American elm, Samuel Harris 11/3/1902, wrongly accused of murder. There are 4 documented lynchings that happened in Lee County, Alabama, where I grew up. But that does not tell us the truth about the real number of those brutally murdered during the Jim Crow era. The names of Mr. George Hart, Mr. John Hart, Mr. Charles Humphreys, and Mr. Samuel Harris are omitted from this historic trail of trees. 50 miles away in Montgomery, their names are tattooed on one of the 800 rusted steel beams that represent the victims of lynchings by white mobs across the counties in Alabama. A necropolis that honors the fathers and sons, mothers and daughters stolen from their families. And just down the road at the Legacy Museum, there's a wall of mason jars filled with soil collected from lynching sites. In hues of rust, black Gulf Coast sand, time capsules of earth and blood. And there is one scion named for the Northern Indian Iroquois, Chief Logan, another for the Trail of Tears, and only one nod to the suffering of the indigenous people of this land, the Muskogee Indians, who were the original inhabitants. None of these scions are named for modern Muskogee descendants. None of them allude to how Muskogee built a complex network of cities composed of earthwork mounds, who skillfully engineered temples, trenches, homes, before white settlers began a steady decimation of the first people by way of disease, murder, looting, slave raids, and forced displacement. What does it mean to be an alien today then? Alien is a shifting target, and the settlers who stole and built this nation were drawing lines between themselves and the alien. And we must know the history of these people, the Native and Black ancestors who gave their lives for us to call this land our home. Back in 1986, in Alabama's landscape, in the trees and hillocks and parks, I was a small child, and I had my first revelations of Americans' history. My father had not yet become a citizen, and I don't think he knew much about this history. Perhaps he thought me too young if he did, but he never told me about the origins of these peak countries, who planted them, who died on them. He never told me how trees and trails are mausoleums hiding in plain sight. Thank you. Thank you. Since I'm moderating, I will keep talking. So we're talking about visibility and kinship in this panel, and I think what was a very powerful reading experience for me, coming from where I come from, I'm a Bangladeshi second-generation immigrant, is really connecting to different parts of each author's work. So for Pitchaya, the inundation of water and the climate and this history that you say, unfold for us in your novel in a non-linear fashion really allows us to get the historicity of Thailand and also this futuristic world that you envision. Souvankam, in short stories, you name and you don't name these refugee experiences from Laos. And where I'm from, refugees after the war, that is another war that Americans don't know about, is something that I was thinking a lot about as I was reading your work. And Sejal, of course, you use the form of the lyric essay beautifully. So I think doing, playing with form as you're talking about the Indian American experience is very different and very unique. So how do you all feel like, and you can each answer this, that, using non-traditional forms to tell your stories, or why you've chosen these particular forms, because they are used by other authors, has allowed you to navigate the complexity of the people that you are trying to give visibility to? So we can start with whoever would like to start, or just go in the order in which we read, whatever you feel. I'll call on Pitchaya.
Hello. For me, trying to portray a city, I felt that playing with just trying to do the traditional form would not be doing it justice. And I wanted a more, like a larger canvas, and that to me encompasses both the human and the non-human, and looking at Bangkok and seeing the history as the city is now. I mean, seeing the city as it is now, I couldn't help but also see the history, and with the way things are, a projection of my imagination of what can be. And for me, playing with form, I talk about this in other interviews in terms of trying to achieve a kind of music, was something that I think I was conscious of doing. I was listening to a lot of jazz when I worked on the book, and there's something about playing with motif and recurrence, is playing with ideas of cause and effect, which is something that helps tell a story. And when I look at Bangkok's story, I think that was the approach that I wanted, because I see right now the effects of the past and the decisions and happiness and tragedies that were created sometime before us echoing into our time. And I see the things that we do now creating a vast effect on the future. And I think that playing with the non-traditional form helped me explore or create a kind of impression of that better.
I definitely felt that. And I loved how characters would come in again, unexpected, and this like sort of, it had that feeling of improvisation and some of the, music that you do explore in the book. So thank you. Souvankam, would you like to talk about your use of, I guess, short story, but the way that you do it? I know that people have called it very spare, but I felt like each story was very full and very rich because of what you decide to name and not name. So I wanted to let you talk a little bit about the choices that you made as you were conceiving the stories. And you're muted, so just unmute.
Okay. In a lot of the stories, I build them around the word here. So I don't explain where here is. I demand a lot from the reader to fill that in themselves. So the reader, I don't give a reader their bearings, and I also don't give the characters their bearings. So everybody kind of feels displaced. And in the short story that I read called Paris, nobody in there ever gets to Paris. And, but because it's titled Paris, every reader takes the idea of Paris into the story, its culture, its fashion, and its sophistication, and we never encounter that in the story. But it haunts us as we read it.
Definitely. I feel the haunting. I mean, when I was reading Paris, I was kind of like, Paris? And then I kept going to the front page and looking at it. And I'm like, fuck, the chicken plant is like where everyone will end up. It will never be Paris. But that is the aspiration that they all have in their heart. So thank you for explaining that. Sejal, I loved how, you gave us this breadth of your work from the 90s to 2019. I feel like it was a time capsule, especially because as another South Asian in diaspora with you, I really knew what you were talking about in terms of how your consciousness shifted. And I felt the lyric essay really allowed you to explore fragmentation of your growing consciousness, but also just, making sense of your identity. So could you talk about, you're a poet and an essayist, and how this hybrid form allowed you to explore the themes in your book?
Yes, thank you. I think I didn't learn about the term lyric essay until 2011. And then when I looked up the definition, I thought, oh, this is what I've been doing. I think that with the compression of poetry, which I haven't been writing for a long time, actually, but I think that it allows for silence, gaps, what we can't say because of trauma or not having the word for it. And I remember, I think this is partly why it was, I found my MFA program so frustrating. Who's the audience? And what are you, what do you have to explain? I love what Souvankam said about, yes, hear and make your reader work for it. And experience that disorientation. And I feel like the lyric essay allowed me to trust also what images and fragments I had been working with, and to see from moving those around almost like a mosaic, to see, what is this picture that's emerging.
Yeah, I love that. I think that really also makes sense given your dance background and how the pastiche of different movement and forms has influenced how you move your body in the world. I'm obviously, like, as all writers, part of you has to like not give a shit about your reader anymore. You just have to write for yourself. But obviously as a reader, I'm like, are you talking to me? Are you telling me what I want you to tell me? Like, we both have that. We all have that experience. So I guess I want to ask, there's this resistance I felt in everyone's work to a monolithic history. And I'd like to start with Souvankam here and then move to either Pitchaya or Sejal. But, Laos and the American imagination, and you grew up in Toronto, you were born in Thailand. Like, you talk a lot about these characters and how they experience joy and desire, and you're not even giving us a historic background on the war, and you're not giving us much of any of that, which I was like, yes, that's how I want to write about Bangladesh, because it's like, here's the trauma, like, do you want this trauma, or do you want like these people? And I think so much of our narrative gets swallowed by the trauma or the American imperialist gaze, the colonial gaze. So starting with Souvankam, I mean, I would love for you to talk about how you navigate things like the white gaze, these characters' desires, the history of Laos, your authenticity as a writer, and really create portraits of people that are very moving and passionate, and really give me a sense of these people. But you do it by not naming so many things. So please illuminate for us how, you kind of have come to this style in your work.
I grew up in Toronto in a neighborhood that is on the corner of Keele Street and Eglinton West. And in that neighborhood, everybody there it's not a big deal to be a refugee because everybody else around you is. And when you grow up in that kind of environment, you don't have to explain to your friends or the people around you where you come from. They know. So I moved with that experience into the writing of the stories. I feel I don't need to do this work for you. And also, I do know that when it comes to history books, Laos is often always a footnote. And I wanted readers to think about the history of Laos and, where is it in the history books, and to desire to know and to search out for it. But I didn't want that to be the thing that I had to explain all the time. Also, anytime I encountered stories of refugees and immigrants, it was always incredibly tragic and sad. And that is, that's absolutely true. But I think to be a full human being, you should be granted your right to be, to be happy, to be ferocious, to be ungrateful, to be seen as people who are fun and funny and sexy. And I wanted to bring those stories into a book to capture that voice.
Yes, and I think that in doing that, you show, sorry, I'm like show versus tell, you show so well, especially through labor. I think labor throughout each story shows how people have to live and struggle, the spaces that they occupy, the sites of their, where they live and where they work, tell us so much more than you actually getting into that history. I think you do that very effectively.
I was thinking of, a lot of times when we talk about immigrants and refugees, we're often talking about successful ones, those who come to a country with your PhD in chemistry or have jobs that other people understand, like they've been an accountant in another country. But I feel people can still be successful and have integrity in the work that they do, even if it is painting nails or plucking feathers in a chicken processing plant. And I didn't want it to be, when I told the story, to be on the outside, but to go into the interior of the person.
Definitely. I love I'm going to move on to someone else. I just want to say like the story about the boxer who starts working in his sister's nail salon. And it's like this big burly dude who's painting nails. And he's like kind of like this hot, sexy dude who doesn't like I want him to paint my nails. And I really love that. I could just see how this space of the nail salon, which, I've been thinking a lot about all these people that I would see every week, every other week. Like, what are they doing right now in this era that we live in? And they are allowed to dream and have desires and be sexy and have all of that. So you did a beautiful job showing that.
Thank you.
Pitchaya or Sejal, I don't know, are either of you burning to talk?
I can take a gander. For me, in writing the book, I was always aware of how visibility is such a strange thing, because you could be visible and yet people can only still see what they want to see. And I found that to be true of Bangkok and Thailand, which is one of the most visited cities in the world. I think there are over 35 million people who pass through Bangkok. But when I see depictions of Thailand and Bangkok, those seem oddly unrecognizable to me. And for the longest time, when I was telling people that I was writing this book, and they're like, "Have you read so and so?" And I'm like, "I have." And they tend to be centered on a very white male Orientalist ideal of Bangkok, which is a Bangkok that is not seen to the majority of the 10, 11 million people who live there.
Like the
And
beach.
that was, yeah. And that is something that I was always conscious of as I was writing the book. And I wanted to present a book that I wanted to write a book that presented characters who are complex people. And I think that it's surprising for some people that we actually exist.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I just interrupted you with saying the beach, like Alex Garland, 90s, like painting Thailand in this kind of white man's fantasy picture, you know, like pleasure and extraction and all these things that are in the American imagination. And I don't even know if you're resisting it. I don't want to put your work in relationship to resisting it. I just felt like in the Toni Morrison sense of water flooding memory and allowing the writer to go into every corner and every space. I mean, that's how water really functions in the book. I mean, it's in every, I mean, I know you're drawing from music, but also just the land itself and how people relate to the land and revolutionary movements that I mean, I feel like Thailand is experiencing another revolutionary resistance right now to the present, you know, so I think that you really show the breadth of that history really beautifully. Sejal, I would love to end with you on this question, and then I'll ask one more question and I want to open up to everyone too.
So I have to admit the answers were so wonderful that I forgot what the question was.
Well, I mean, I guess I'll ask you specifically. So you're writing about being Indian American, right? And this is a terrain that in the imagination of American literature, we've had Jhumpa Lahiri, we've had Arundhati Roy, we've had different people kind of explore this terrain, and you're offering your version of this. What is visibility for you as you're navigating this work as an Indian American, Gujarati American, but not, you know, doing it in a way where you're speaking in Gujarati or writing in these scenes that are very authentically Indian? I mean, you're offering something else. And even reading it, like, I would be a participant in Garbas, wishing so hard that we had Garba in my culture, but we don't. But also, you know, my last name's Islam, so 9/11 had a whole different energy for me. Even thinking about the massacres in Gujarat and Modi being the president and what that means as a Gujarati. I mean, you're like holding so much, right? But then you are also writing your life and your experience. So like navigating like the larger forces and the larger ideas of Indianness, nation state, but doing it in a way that honors you and your history and your personal life and what you're trying to accomplish with these lyric essays. So I just want you to talk about process, but also your work, like just how do you see it fitting into these conversations about visibility and invisibility?
You know, it's funny, I think I find even hearing Indian American uncomfortable for me. And I wrote sometimes Indian and Indian American, but yeah, I'm Gujarati and I'm from Rochester, and though I lived in other places, I wanted to center that, right? Rochester's not the center of anything. We're certainly not the center of New York State. And you know, we know that all the time based on, you know, how Cuomo I saw us we were called the Finger Lakes region. And I had a whole discussion about, you know, do we consider ourselves, what do we call ourselves really? And then my brother, I had mentioned that Suketi, my cousin, married a South Indian. My brother also married a South Indian. I later, 20 years later, married a South Indian guy. And so Indian is just is so abstract. I feel like that's a translation for other people and a shorthand that I use. But really, I think I wanted to center these experiences that I didn't see centered. at all. And it was difficult figuring out what did I want to translate and what did I not want to translate. Part of me doesn't want to translate anything, doesn't want to explain anything. My press had originally asked, as a courtesy to the reader, any words that weren't in English should be italicized. And I couldn't do that, and I explained why, and they went with it. But it was, I think, just that having to think about who is the audience? Who am I telling this story to? Am I telling it to myself? Am I telling it to my partner? Am I you can make yourself a little crazy, right? Like which editor? How am I going to? I ended up taking Indian is not on the back cover of my book at all. And what I'm wearing, this is me turning in a Janyajuri that I wish I had bought for my wedding and didn't buy, and that's a whole other essay. So I wanted something that was very specifically Gujarati. Dimple Lahiri is a wonderful writer, and she's Bengali. It felt like reading, and I had Bengali friends growing up, and I lived in New England. I appreciated reading those stories, but those stories weren't my stories. I wanted to have.
Those stories weren't even my stories.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, it's very specific, and I wanted to write about growing up. My relatives live in California and in New Jersey, and we spent time going to Toronto. Those are so different. Each place is so different. So, what is it like to grow up Indian, away from the coast and away from a major urban center?
Yeah, I loved how you talked about the different cities and towns you lived in, being in the desert during Burning Man. I mean, these are places I want to see an Indian woman's body. So thank you for doing that. I'm actually not going to ask any more questions. I'm going to go to the audience, our beloved readers. And I'm just going to present them to you. And some of them are specific to certain authors and some of them are general. So Jean Kwok. Souvankam, one of the things I love about your collection is how it hones in on these quiet but powerfully resonant moments. Other than on a sentence level, can you talk about how poetry might inform your story writing?
Poetry taught me that a title of a story can have the same sort of power as the text in the body of a story. And to always make a sentence matter. There's a reason, if you write a sentence, it better matter. It has to hold something together. It has to be a nut and bolt to the structure of your story. It can't just be frivolous.
Thank you. For Mimosa Shah. Hi, Mimosa. How do you exercise kinship and make space for vulnerability in a society that prizes grit and resilience instead? So anyone who'd like to jump in on that question?
I could. I don't know if I mentioned that my essay the essay that I read from was called Kinship, Cousins, and Kitchdi. So is very much about kinship. I think we have to extend who we think of as kin. In terms of vulnerability, I published an essay last year on invisible disability and neurodiversity, and it's not in my book, but I think that was the most vulnerable that I allowed myself to be in writing, and it brought the most people to my door, people I knew and people I didn't know writing to me. And I did it finally because I felt like someone has to talk about this, and I can right now. I didn't know what to expect, but I think that being able to, I guess I'll just end there.
Can I say something about grit and resilience?
Yes.
I think grit and resilience is not very far from being open and vulnerable and being scared. I think they're a consequence, or grit and resilience are, a consequence of being vulnerable. They come from being vulnerable. They're not separate, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. To just go for it and to be, resilient is a deep act of vulnerability. I think just to cross an ocean on a raft to get to a new land, I mean, that is as vulnerable as it gets. So thank you for that. Pitchaya, do you want to answer that question, or can I move on to another question?
I can talk a little bit. I was gonna ask, when people talk about grit and resilience, you have to ask who is doing the asking and what are they demanding? Because oftentimes the people who are saying these words are the people who want something from you, and it's an issue of power inequalities. And when people talk about these subjects, they are asking, why can't you tolerate more? Why don't you work harder? So these are the factors I think you have to consider. And also, vulnerability is a strange thing also, because you have to be able to afford vulnerability in this society. And sometimes that's possible, and people can purchase vulnerability or the ability to be open. And for me, the way that you get past discussions of affordability is if you can somehow create community. And as you were talking about before, about expanding your view of who you talk to and who you're with, I think can help, because I think when you feel safe, then you allow yourself to become more vulnerable. And I think that's what everyone can do.
Absolutely. We have a question from Aye Bande Ahmadi for Souvankam and others, so everyone. What is your writing community like, and how did you have to learn to push back when readers or pubs or writing groups want more explanation in your writing? And Souvankam, I think I read in one of your interviews that you had to rewrite an ending a bunch of times for a magazine, and then they finally wanted the original version, which I'm like, obviously they wanted the original version. But can you just answer that? And I'd love to hear everybody talk about writing. You've all been writing for many years, right? So I mean,
I didn't do an MFA at all. I read in open mics, and so I would get feedback from the audience. If they stopped eating, if they stopped paying attention to the sports television, the sport event on the television in the bar, I knew that I was doing something special. How do I don't know, how do I resist what other people tell me how to write? I don't know. I know my own voice, and I know my own gaze. And I've honed it, and nobody can change that or take it away from me.
Yeah, that's a mic drop. You can end that one there. No one can take that away from you. Pitchaya or Sejal, do you want to answer this question? How did you learn to push back when readers or pubs or writing groups wanted more explanation for your writing? And if all of you are offering a lot of space in your work for no explanation. So Pitchaya,
I think I'm also along the same lines of proceeding in the way that's true to you, because the moment for me when I find myself trying to explain, then that's a moment in which my writerly self just, all the flags of falsehood just comes up. And I think that, I also never did an MFA as well, and maybe that helped me to stay, I think, steady in my course, because I was entertaining myself as I write. I was the audience. So if it didn't sound right to me, then it's not right. And I went with what I felt was true to the book. And it's what the book wants. You can only do as the book wants you to.
Absolutely. Sejal, did you want to add anything to that question? There's
Yeah,
one
you
more
have to
question.
write it down. Only do what the book wants. That's right. I think my MFA did a number on me. I started in 1997, right after The God of Small Things came out, and I was in grad school when Jhumpa Lahiri's The Interpreter of Maladies came out. So there was really this sense of, write this certain kind of story, and then you're going to be famous and you're going to make money. And that was not my story. I had been to India once. I wanted to write about other things.
Can I actually, because we have 2 more minutes. The last question is an Indian writer question, so I want to just tack it on to what you're talking about. From Sayantika Mandal. As an Indian writer living in the US, I've shied away from telling stories set in South Asia and not from a diasporic eye because I feel they would be rejected, since the readers and editors of journals or magazines won't be able to relate to these stories. How do you think I make these stories heard and visible? So since this person's specifically talking about South Asia, Sejal, I would like for you to start, and then Pitchaya and Souvankam, please feel free to add. And then that would be the last question.
I think you have to make it visible to yourself first. We don't know what editors are going to think, and there are a range of editors. So I think as much as you can to write down, to separate the writing process, I think, from someone perceiving it, what someone is going to perceive. And things are changing.
I actually want to say something as the moderator. I just think that our desire to shy away, it is part of this legacy of feeling cornered into telling one version of the story, which Sejal being, coming up in the 90s, I'm sure you felt the pressure of that narrative very deeply. But I think that what I've realized is that as a diaspora, we are still a projection of the subcontinent in some way. And we have these ways of relating to each other, these syncretic relationships, these ways of navigating identity without borders. I mean, you're married to a Tamilian guy. I have friends who are of all religions. These are very contentious issues in the motherland. And I think there's value that even if the diaspora and editors don't recognize that, I think there's a value in setting our stories wherever the fuck we want to set our stories, because no one can take away your experience from you. So that's my 2 cents on that. Souvankam or Pitchaya, do you have anything to add in terms of diaspora and telling the stories?
I want to say to that person who asked the question, you should write and not care about what an editor thinks. You tell them what's good. You tell them what a good quality sentence and story is, and if they're a good editor, they will recognize that. I mean, I wrote a short story about a 70-year-old woman who sleeps with a 32-year-old man, and it got published, and it had and it had nothing to do with being loud. Often we write because we think that there's an audience, waiting for it. But sometimes you write to get an audience to find you. So just keep writing.
Can I say one thing?
Sure, absolutely.
I just wanted to say I wrote a very brief essay that I sent to all of you, things people said about stupid things people said to me about my wedding or being Indian, and how, could I come to your wedding? I've never been to an Indian wedding. It's not a fucking circus. If I don't know you, no, you can't come to my wedding if you've never been to my house. And I came back from the doctor trying to get some mental health meds, and I was talking to my husband, and he said, you're talking out your book, write it down. right? Just these things that were making me so angry. And that little essay is my editor read that, my editor found me through that essay for my book. So you'd be surprised. I mean, it was not an essay that I labored over. It was the things that were making me mad, but I think that it came through. Something will come through. You have to trust yourself on that.
Absolutely. Pitchaya, did you want to add a couple of last words to this question of diaspora, and then thank you all for your brilliance and your time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to echo others in pretty much telling people to basically stick to what you can control. And what you can control is your writing and the book that you have, because there's going to be plenty of opportunity in the future when there are so many things that are outside of your control. The closer you are to publication, the less control you have of anything. And you just keep on editing that book, and at a certain point, it's done. And you just let this thing out into the world. So don't worry about other things, because that's far in the future.
Thank you so much. I am just grateful to have been with your work for the past couple of weeks. And thank you all for being here with us. As writers, we don't get a lot of feedback on our work. Without readings, we have zero feedback. So this is a great way to support us. Buy the books, support these writers, tweet about their shit, like just do what the things we need you to do to keep us working. And Michael, I will let you wrap up, tie the bow on everything, but thank you all so much.
Thank you.